There is an old saying among farmers: a man may own the land for a while, but the land owns his legacy forever. Most people think a farm is just another piece of property: acres, boundaries, buildings, machinery, money. But anyone who has ever worked the soil knows better. A farm remembers. It remembers the first footprints pressed into wet ground after the spring rains. It remembers every seed planted with hope, every drought survived through faith, every fence repaired in the darkness, every child who learned to walk between rows of corn, every tear that disappeared into the soil where no one else could see it. The land remembers everything. That is why selling a farm is rarely just a business transaction. Sometimes it is the beginning of a tragedy. My name is Mr. Judge. I've listened to farmers from every corner of the countryside. I've heard stories of fortunes built from nothing. I've watched neighbors become enemies over a single fence line. I've seen brothers stop speaking for decades because of one inheritance. And I've learned something many people never understand. The biggest mistakes in farming rarely begin with tractors. They begin with decisions. Today's story is about a man who believed one signature could solve all his problems. Instead, it destroyed everything he spent 40 years building. This is the story of Thomas Carter. And before we're finished, you'll understand why the richest field on any farm is never the one with the highest market value. The town of Willow Creek sat quietly in the rolling countryside of Iowa. Just under 4,000 people. One grain elevator, 2 churches, a feed store, a small mechanic's garage, a cafe where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast, and just outside town lay Carter Farms, 800 acres. Passed down through 4 generations. It wasn't the biggest farm in the county. But everyone agreed on one thing. Thomas Carter owned the finest 100 acres anyone had ever seen. Rich black soil, perfect drainage, gentle slopes, no rocks, no flooding, no erosion. Old farmers joked that if you accidentally dropped corn on that field, it would apologize for growing too fast. Every harvest proved them right. Year after year, those 100 acres produced more than fields twice their size. Thomas called it the North Field. His grandfather called it God's gift. His father simply called it home. Thomas never imagined anyone else would ever own it. He was 62 years old. Broad shoulders, weathered hands, sunburned face. The kind of man whose handshake told you everything before he ever spoke. Every morning, he woke at 4:30. Coffee, weather report, barn inspection, equipment check. Then the fields, always the fields. His wife Margaret often laughed. "I think you'd walk those acres even if someone paid you to stay inside." Thomas always smiled. "I don't check the crops because I don't trust them." "Then why?" "Because they trusted me enough to grow." Their children had grown up. Emily became a veterinarian in Minnesota. Daniel worked as an agricultural engineer in Nebraska. Neither planned to return permanently. Thomas understood, mostly. Every parent hopes the next generation continues the family legacy. But farming wasn't easy anymore. Costs rose every year. Fuel, fertilizer, seeds, insurance, equipment. Meanwhile, commodity prices seemed determined to punish everyone who actually produced food. Thomas never blamed his children. Still, when he walked through the North Field alone, he wondered who would someday care for it. Harvest season arrived beautifully that year. The combines rolled across golden corn. The grain bins filled. Neighbors congratulated Thomas. "It's another record year. You've still got the magic touch. Nobody grows corn like you." Thomas accepted the compliments politely. But farming had taught him humility. One good year meant nothing. Weather could erase decades overnight. Markets could destroy profits before the grain ever left the truck. Success on a farm wasn't measured by one harvest. It was measured by surviving long enough to see another. Then the letter arrived. A plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was an offer unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. A development company wanted to purchase exactly 100 acres, not the whole farm. Only the North Field. Purchase price, $22 million. Thomas read the number again, then one more time. Surely someone had misplaced a decimal point. No farmland in Willow Creek sold for anything close to that. Not even half. Not even a quarter. Margaret looked over his shoulder. "What is it?" Thomas couldn't answer. He simply handed her the letter. Her eyes widened. Silence filled the kitchen. Finally, she whispered, "That's enough money for our grandchildren to never work again." Thomas stared through the window, across the road, toward the North Field. The evening sun painted the corn gold. For the first time in his life, he looked at that field, not as a farmer, but as a number. $22 million. And that single thought would change everything. The letter stayed on Thomas Carter's kitchen table for 3 days. He never threw it away. He never accepted it. He simply looked at it every morning before heading to the fields. $22 million. The number refused to leave his mind. For 40 years, he had measured success in bushels per acre, healthy livestock, and good rainfall. Now someone had placed a price tag on the piece of land he loved most. Margaret noticed the change almost immediately. Thomas still woke before sunrise. He still checked the barns. He still serviced the tractors. But something was different. Whenever he reached the North Field, he no longer saw rows of thriving corn. He saw dollar signs, and that frightened him. 1 week later, a sleek black SUV rolled slowly down the dusty road leading to Carter Farms. People in Willow Creek noticed immediately. Vehicles like that rarely came to farming communities. The driver stepped out first, dressed in a tailored navy suit despite the summer heat. Moments later, another man emerged. He looked to be in his early 50s, confident, calm, expensively dressed. His polished boots had clearly never stepped into mud. He extended his hand. "Mr. Carter." Thomas nodded cautiously. "I'm Richard Halston. I represent Green Horizon Development." Thomas immediately recognized the company name from the letter. Richard smiled. "I hope we aren't interrupting your day." "You already have," Richard laughed politely. "I appreciate honesty." Thomas remained silent. Farmers often judge people by how comfortable they were with silence. Richard clearly wasn't. He immediately began talking. "We've been studying this area for almost 3 years. The location is perfect. The highway expansion, the nearby river, the quality of the land, the future population growth." Thomas interrupted. "You want my field?" Richard smiled again. "The best field." Richard unfolded several large architectural drawings across the tailgate of Thomas's pickup truck. Colorful illustrations showed something almost unbelievable. Luxury homes, artificial lakes, golf courses, shopping centers, private schools, medical facilities, restaurants, walking trails, solar-powered neighborhoods, a community designed for wealthy families. Richard pointed directly at the center. "This is where your North Field sits." Thomas stared at the drawings. The rich black soil that had fed generations of families, covered by concrete, covered by asphalt, covered by expensive houses. Richard continued, We're not buying farmland. We're building the future. Thomas folded his arms. My future is already growing. Richard smiled politely. But your children's future? That question landed harder than Thomas expected. The numbers keep growing. Richard reached into his briefcase. This is our final proposal. Thomas unfolded the document. His breathing slowed. The offer had increased. Not $22 million, $25 million. Plus, a lifetime consulting position, a brand new home, health care coverage, a museum section inside the development honoring Carter Farms, even a road named after his family. Carter Heritage Boulevard. Richard looked pleased. We want to preserve your legacy. Thomas looked toward the fields. My legacy doesn't need a street sign. Richard answered quietly. Every man says that. Until he realizes what he could leave his family. That evening, Thomas called his children. Emily drove in from Minnesota. Daniel flew in from Nebraska. For the first time in months, the Carter family gathered around the old oak dining table. Thomas explained everything. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. Dad, that's life-changing money. Emily nodded slowly. It could pay for our children's education. We could establish scholarships, expand the veterinary clinic, support agricultural research. Margaret listened quietly. Then she looked at Thomas. What do you think? Thomas rubbed his forehead. I don't know. I've never had this much to think about. Daniel leaned forward. Dad, you've spent your entire life working. You've earned the right to enjoy it, Emily agreed. You always taught us to make wise decisions. Maybe this is one. Thomas remained quiet. Just as the conversation seemed settled, Margaret spoke. I don't like it. Everyone turned. Thomas looked surprised. Why? She looked out the kitchen window toward the north field. Because they're not buying dirt. They're buying memories. Silence. She continued. That field fed your grandfather. It fed your father. It paid for Emily's college. It paid for Daniel's engineering degree. It carried us through drought. It carried us through recession. It carried us when we thought we'd lose everything. She looked directly at Thomas. You don't sell the hand that fed your family. Daniel sighed. Mom, land is an investment, Margaret answered immediately. No. It's an inheritance. By the next morning, everyone in Willow Creek knew. Farm communities have a way of sharing news faster than the internet. The feed store buzzed with speculation. Thomas would be crazy not to sell. 25 million? I'd sell before breakfast. Others disagreed. Once farmland becomes concrete, it never becomes farmland again. Old Ben Walker, an 80-year-old farmer whose family owned neighboring land, simply shook his head. I've buried 2 wives, 3 brothers, my parents, my best friend. Money never visited a single funeral. The younger farmers laughed, but Ben wasn't finished. I've also watched 4 families sell their farms. They all believed they were buying freedom. None of them ever looked happy afterward. Unable to sleep that night, Thomas grabbed a flashlight. He walked toward the north field alone. The moonlight covered the corn in silver. The breeze moved gently through the stalks. It sounded almost like whispers. He remembered being 10 years old, his father teaching him how to judge soil by rubbing it between his fingers, his grandfather showing him where the first family well had stood, the old oak tree where he proposed to Margaret, the exact spot where Emily took her first steps, the fence Daniel accidentally drove through with the family tractor. Every corner of that field held a memory. No blueprint showed those. No developer could purchase them. He knelt down, scooped a handful of rich black earth, let it slowly fall through his fingers. Soft, warm, alive. He whispered quietly, "What would Dad do?" The wind answered with silence. The following afternoon, Richard Halston returned. This time, he wasn't alone. 3 luxury SUVs pulled into Carter Farms. Lawyers, surveyors, financial advisors. Richard smiled confidently. "I assume you've had time to think." Thomas nodded. "I have." Richard opened his briefcase. "We've made one more adjustment." Thomas frowned. "Another?" Richard slid over a new contract. Thomas's eyes widened. $30 million. Richard folded his hands. "I don't believe anyone has ever been offered more for farmland in this county." He paused. "But this offer expires in 72 hours. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. $30 million. 3 days. One decision. Thomas looked toward the window once more. Beyond the glass, the north field stood peacefully beneath the evening sun, unaware that its future now rested on a signature. Mr. Judge often says, "The hardest choices are never between good and bad. They are between 2 things that both seem right, until time reveals which one truly was." Thomas Carter had 72 hours to decide. He believed he was choosing between land and money. He had no idea. He was really choosing between legacy and regret. The countdown had begun. 72 hours. To some people, 3 days pass unnoticed. To Thomas Carter, every hour now felt heavier than the one before. He tried to focus on the farm. The soybeans needed inspecting. The irrigation pumps required maintenance. A bearing on combine number 2 had started making an unusual noise. Normally, these tasks demanded his full attention. Not anymore. Every few minutes, his mind drifted back to the contract sitting inside the kitchen drawer. $30 million. One signature, one decision. That night, Thomas barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, he walked onto the front porch with a mug of black coffee. The farm was quiet. The only sounds were crickets, distant coyotes, and the gentle hum of grain dryers from neighboring farms. Margaret joined him without saying a word. After 40 years of marriage, she knew when silence was more valuable than conversation. Finally, Thomas spoke. "What if I'm being stubborn?" Margaret looked across the fields. "What if you're being wise?" He sighed. "What if I keep the land and regret losing $30 million? She smiled gently. "And what if you sell the land and regret it every day afterward?" Neither answered. Some questions cannot be solved before sunrise. The next afternoon, another surprise arrived. It wasn't Richard Halston. It wasn't another developer. It was Thomas's bank manager. Harold Benson had known the Carter family for more than 30 years. He wasn't just a banker. He was a neighbor, a friend. He removed his cap as he stepped into the workshop. "Tom, we need to talk." Thomas immediately sensed something was wrong. Harold hesitated. "I wasn't going to mention this, but since the whole county already knows about the offer." Thomas folded his arms. "Go on." Harold took a deep breath. "Interest rates have climbed again. The operating loan on the south property is about to reset." Thomas frowned. So your annual financing costs will almost double." Thomas stood quietly. Harold continued. "You're still financially stable, but margins are getting tighter every year. Machinery costs are increasing. Fertilizer isn't getting cheaper. Neither is labor." Harold looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "I'm not telling you to sell. I'm telling you the next 10 years won't look like the last 10. Those words stayed with Thomas long after Harold drove away, as if the pressure wasn't already enough. Disaster struck. During a routine harvest test, the transmission on Thomas's primary combine failed. The repair estimate came the following morning, $84,000. Thomas stared at the invoice. Years earlier, that amount could have purchased an entire farm. Now, it barely repaired one machine. His longtime mechanic, Jake Morrison, shook his head. They don't build simple equipment anymore. It's computers, sensors, hydraulics. Everything costs a fortune. Thomas forced a smile. Seems like farming gets more expensive every year. Jake nodded. And somehow the crops never hear about inflation. Both men laughed, but only briefly. Later that afternoon, Thomas walked toward the oldest oak tree on the property. Its branches stretched across the edge of the north field. His grandfather had planted it nearly 90 years earlier. Thomas sat beneath it and closed his eyes. He remembered being a little boy. His grandfather, Samuel Carter, would always sit beneath that same tree after harvest. One afternoon, young Thomas had asked, "Grandpa, why don't we sell some land and become rich?" Samuel smiled, then scooped a handful of soil into the boy's hands. "What do you feel?" "Dirt." Samuel laughed. "No, this isn't dirt. It's opportunity. It's responsibility. It's tomorrow." Young Thomas looked confused. Samuel continued, "Money disappears. Land feeds generations. You can spend money only once. But good land keeps giving." At the time, Thomas hadn't understood. Now, those words echoed louder than ever. The following morning, Thomas decided to inspect an old drainage ditch running through the edge of the north field. Heavy rain had washed away part of the bank. As he examined the erosion, something caught his attention. A rusted metal box protruded from the soil. Curious, he carefully dug it free. Inside were several weathered documents wrapped in oilcloth, old photographs, property maps, letters. One document immediately stood out. It was dated October 17th, 1948, signed by his grandfather. Thomas carefully unfolded the faded paper. The handwriting was still readable. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a deed. It was a letter, addressed simply, "To whoever owns this land after me." Thomas's hands trembled. He began reading. "If you're reading this, then enough years have passed that I am no longer here to walk these fields. I hope the land has treated you kindly. Remember something the world often forgets. A farm isn't measured by what someone offers to buy it. Its true value is measured by how many lives it continues to feed. There will come a day when someone offers more money than you ever imagined. When that day comes, ask yourself one question. Will this decision make my grandchildren proud or merely wealthy? Those are not always the same thing. Choose carefully. The land is only borrowed. Protect it while it's your turn." Samuel Carter. Thomas lowered the letter, his eyes filled with tears, while he looked across the north field. The wind moved gently across the corn, almost as if his grandfather were still there, watching, waiting. Only 24 hours remained. Richard Halston arrived precisely at 3 o'clock. This time, he came alone. He smiled as Thomas welcomed him into the house. "I hope you've reached a decision." Thomas nodded slowly. "I have." Richard placed the contract on the table. He uncapped an expensive fountain pen. "I believe congratulations are in order." Thomas looked at the pen, then at the contract, then at the window overlooking the north field. Minutes passed. Neither man spoke. Finally, Thomas picked up the pen. Margaret quietly watched from the doorway. Emily and Daniel stood silently behind her. Thomas's hand hovered above the signature line. He could hear his own heartbeat. $30 million. Every debt erased, every financial worry gone. His grandchildren's future secured. The pen touched the paper, and then Thomas stopped. He slowly lifted the pen again. Richard frowned. Is something wrong? Thomas folded the contract very carefully, then slid it back across the table. I'm sorry. Richard looked confused. I'm not selling. Silence. Long, heavy silence. Richard blinked. I'm not sure you understand. I do. Mr. Carter, you're walking away from $30 million. Thomas smiled for the first time in days. No. I'm walking towards something money can't replace. Richard leaned back. You'll regret this, Thomas calmly replied. Maybe, but I'd regret the opposite a lot more. Richard gathered his papers without another word. As the SUV disappeared down the gravel road, Thomas stepped outside. The evening sun bathed the north field in gold once again. For the first time in weeks, he no longer saw dollar signs. He saw home. Most people think temptation always comes wearing ugly clothes. It doesn't. Sometimes temptation arrives in a tailored suit, carrying a briefcase, offering you everything you've ever wanted. The question isn't whether the offer is valuable. The question is whether what you're giving up is worth even more. The morning after Richard Halston left Carter Farms, Thomas woke at 4:30 a.m., as he had for decades. No lawyers, no contracts, no phone calls, just the familiar rhythm of farm life. He poured his coffee, slipped on his worn boots, and stepped outside. The air smelled of dew and fresh soil. As he walked toward the north field, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the rows of corn. Thomas bent down, picked up a handful of earth, and smiled. For the first time in weeks, his heart felt light. Margaret watched him from the porch. You look different. Thomas chuckled. I finally slept. Life on a farm doesn't pause for life's biggest decisions. Within days, the combines were back in the fields. Neighbors worked together from sunrise until long after sunset. Tractors hauled full grain carts. Dust clouds drifted across the county roads. The familiar sound of harvesting echoed through Willow Creek. Thomas worked harder than ever, not because he had something to prove, but because he had rediscovered something he had almost lost: purpose. Every Saturday morning, the farmers gathered at Miller's Cafe. The conversations were predictable: rainfall, fuel prices, machinery, markets. This week, however, there was only one topic: Thomas Carter. Some believed he had made the smartest decision of his life. Others thought he had lost his mind. One younger farmer shook his head. I still can't believe anyone would refuse $30 million. Across the table, old Ben Walker quietly stirred his coffee. Then he smiled. You boys think wealth is measured by the biggest check. He looked around the room. I've lived long enough to know that peace of mind is worth a lot more. The cafe fell silent. Nobody argued. 3 months passed. Autumn painted the countryside in shades of gold, orange, and crimson. Then the first rumors began. Green Horizon Development had stopped buying land. Construction projects in neighboring counties had suddenly been suspended. Investors were asking questions. Banks were becoming nervous. Few people paid attention. Until the headlines appeared. Reports suggested that several of the company's largest projects had been financed with enormous amounts of borrowed money. Interest rates had risen dramatically. Investors began pulling out. Construction halted. Employees were laid off. Within weeks, the company was fighting for survival. Thomas watched the evening news in complete silence. Margaret turned toward him. That could have been our field. Thomas slowly nodded. 6 months later, Willow Creek witnessed something almost unbelievable. One of Green Horizons' unfinished luxury developments, only 30 miles away, was being auctioned. Thomas decided to drive there, not out of curiosity, out of gratitude. He stood quietly behind the crowd. Half-finished houses stretched across what had once been fertile farmland. Concrete roads ended abruptly. Empty foundations filled with rainwater. Broken fences, abandoned machinery, overgrown weeds. What had been promised as a dream community now looked like a forgotten ghost town. An elderly farmer standing beside Thomas whispered, "My grandfather used to grow wheat here." Thomas didn't answer. He simply stared across the abandoned land. He imagined the crops that would never grow there again. Nearly a year after the rejected offer, a familiar pickup truck rolled slowly into Carter Farms. Thomas immediately recognized the man behind the wheel, Richard Halston. But this wasn't the confident executive who had once stepped out of a luxury SUV. Gone were the expensive suits. Gone was the polished confidence. He wore jeans, a faded work shirt, and a tired expression. Thomas walked over. "Morning," Richard managed a weak smile. "Morning." For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Thomas folded his arms. "For what?" "For thinking I understood value." Richard looked across the north field. "You know, when I first came here, I didn't see a farm. I saw an investment." He laughed quietly. "I spent 25 years convincing people that land only mattered if someone could build something on it." He paused. "I was wrong." Thomas listened without interrupting. Richard continued, "When Green Horizon collapsed, I lost almost everything. My job, my reputation, my retirement, my house, my marriage." Thomas looked surprised. Richard nodded. "My wife said I spent my whole life chasing property and forgot the people waiting at home." Richard reached into his truck. This time, there was no contract, no briefcase, no legal documents, only a small wooden box. He handed it to Thomas. Inside was an old pocket compass. "My father gave this to me. He was a farmer. I left the farm when I was 18. I spent the rest of my life trying to prove farming wasn't important." He smiled sadly. "I think he was right all along." Thomas closed the box. "I can't accept this." Richard shook his head. "I insist. It belongs with someone who still knows which direction matters." That spring, Emily returned home with exciting news. She had partnered with a nearby university on a long-term soil research project. Scientists had recently analyzed samples from the North Field. The results stunned everyone. The soil contained exceptionally high levels of natural organic matter, remarkable biodiversity, and decades of careful stewardship. Agricultural researchers estimated that restoring degraded land to match the health of the North Field could take generations. One professor remarked, "This isn't just productive farmland. It's one of the healthiest agricultural ecosystems we've studied in the region." The findings attracted attention from farming organizations across the state. Soon, students, researchers, and young farmers began visiting Carter Farms, not to buy it, but to learn from it. Thomas smiled every time he welcomed another group. His grandfather had always said good land should feed people. Now it was feeding knowledge as well. One evening, Thomas found his son standing alone beside the old oak tree. Daniel looked across the north field for a long time before speaking. "Dad, I owe you an apology." Thomas smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything. I do. I wanted you to sell." I thought I was being practical. He paused. But after everything that's happened, I finally understand. Thomas looked at his son. What do you understand? Daniel bent down and picked up a handful of soil. You weren't protecting land. You were protecting our family story. Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. And someday, it'll be your turn. Daniel nodded quietly. I'd like that. For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to imagine a fifth generation walking those same fields. Many people believe success is getting the highest offer. But real success is knowing what should never be for sale. Money can buy land, it can buy buildings, it can buy machines, but it cannot buy history, it cannot buy trust, and it can never buy back a legacy once it's been traded away. For nearly 2 years after refusing Green Horizons' offer, life at Carter Farm settled into a familiar rhythm. The seasons came and went. Spring brought fresh hope. Summer demanded long hours. Autumn rewarded patience. Winter offered time to reflect. Thomas often said that farming was one of the few professions where every year reminded you how little control you truly had. You can prepare the soil, he would tell visiting students. You can plant the best seed. You can maintain the finest equipment. But in the end, you still have to trust God, the weather, and your willingness to keep going. No one realized how soon those words would be tested. It began with an unusual weather forecast. Meteorologists warned of a powerful storm system moving across the Midwest. Heavy rainfall, violent winds, large hail, possible flooding. The warnings grew more serious with each passing hour. Farmers across Willow Creek rushed to secure equipment. Grain bins were inspected. Machinery was moved indoors. Livestock were brought into safer shelters. Thomas and Daniel worked late into the night. Every gate was checked, every fuel tank filled, every tractor parked safely inside the machinery shed. Margaret stood on the porch watching the dark clouds gather. They don't look good, Thomas nodded. They're worse than they look. Just after midnight, the storm arrived. The wind howled like a freight train. Rain pounded the roof with unbelievable force. Lightning lit the countryside almost continuously. Trees bent until they seemed certain to snap. Power lines swayed violently. Then the electricity failed. The Carter family sat together in candlelight. Outside, nature reminded everyone who truly controlled the harvest. Around 3 a.m, a deafening crack echoed across the property. The old oak tree, the one planted by Samuel Carter nearly 90 years earlier, collapsed beneath the force of the wind. Thomas closed his eyes. He didn't say a word. When daylight finally arrived, the county barely recognized itself. Roads were blocked. Telephone poles lay scattered across fields. Barn roofs had been torn away. Thousands of acres of corn were flattened. Soybean fields stood underwater. Fences had disappeared. Livestock wandered freely where pastures once stood. Thomas slowly drove through Carter Farms. He expected the worst. Some fields had suffered damage. Several outbuildings needed repairs. One grain bin had lost part of its roof. But then he reached the north field. He stopped the truck, stepped out, and simply stared. The corn still stood, not perfectly, but remarkably well. The gentle slopes, healthy soil structure, decades of careful conservation and natural drainage had protected much of the field from the worst flooding. Daniel looked around in amazement. I don't understand. Thomas smiled softly. I do. Healthy land protects those who protect it. The following days were heartbreaking. Many farmers had lost nearly everything. Some fields were complete losses. Others faced months of expensive recovery. Insurance would cover only part of the damage. Several older farmers quietly admitted they might never financially recover. The atmosphere in Willow Creek changed. People stopped talking about profits. Now they talked about survival. 3 days after the storm, Thomas called a meeting at the local community hall. Nearly every farming family attended. People expected updates, perhaps fundraising, maybe government assistance. Instead, Thomas stood before them with a simple piece of paper. "I've been blessed. My family has been blessed. Our farm survived better than most." He looked around the room. "So we've made a decision." He unfolded the paper. "This year's profits from the North Field will not stay with the Carter family." The room became completely silent. Thomas continued, "We're establishing the Willow Creek Farm Recovery Fund. Every dollar of profit from this harvest will help local farming families rebuild." Nobody spoke. Several people lowered their heads. Old Ben Walker wiped away tears. Thomas's announcement inspired something extraordinary. The Miller family donated diesel fuel. The Johnson family loaned machinery free of charge. Emily organized veterinary services for injured livestock. Daniel volunteered engineering support to repair damaged grain systems. Local mechanics offered discounted labor. Teenagers spent weekends rebuilding fences. Churches prepared meals for exhausted farming families. Even businesses from neighboring towns contributed supplies. Within weeks, Willow Creek had become a symbol of what a farming community could accomplish when neighbors stood together. Reporters arrived. Television crews followed. Journalists asked Thomas the same question again and again. Why give away your profits? His answer never changed. Because no farmer succeeds alone. One evening, Richard Halston watched the news from his modest apartment. The headline read, "Local farmer leads community recovery after devastating storm." He smiled, not with regret this time, with admiration. He quietly whispered, "I finally understand." The next morning, Richard began volunteering with an agricultural nonprofit that helped preserve farmland and support struggling farming communities. His life had taken an unexpected direction, not because he gained more, but because he finally learned what truly mattered. Months later, a group of children from a nearby elementary school visited Carter Farms. Thomas led them into the North Field. One little boy asked, "Mr. Carter, why didn't you sell this place?" Thomas smiled. Instead of answering immediately, he knelt down and handed the boy a handful of rich black soil. "What do you think this is worth?" The boy shrugged. "It looks like dirt." Thomas gently smiled. "It does. But someday, it might feed your family." The boy looked down at the soil with new eyes. Sometimes, the greatest lessons cannot be taught. They must be held. A true harvest isn't measured only by what fills your grain bins. It's measured by the lives your choices help grow. The wealthiest farmer isn't always the one with the biggest bank account. Often, it's the one whose neighbors know they can knock on his door when the storm has passed. 10 years later, time has a remarkable way of judging our decisions. Not immediately, not the next day. Sometimes it takes years before we truly understand whether we made the right choice. 10 years passed. Willow Creek changed. New families moved into town. Some farms expanded. Others disappeared. Technology transformed agriculture. GPS-guided tractors, artificial intelligence, drone crop monitoring, robotic equipment, variable rate planting. Farming looked different than it had a decade earlier. But one thing remained unchanged. The North Field. Every spring it came alive again. Every summer it stretched toward the sky. Every autumn it rewarded faithful hands. And every winter, it rested, waiting patiently for another season. Thomas Carter often stood at the edge of that field before sunrise. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Daniel eventually returned home. Not because farming was easy, not because it was more profitable than engineering, because he finally understood what his father had been protecting. His wife embraced farm life. Their 2 children, Noah and Grace, grew up much the way Thomas had. They learned to identify soil by touch. They knew the names of every field. They could drive a tractor before they were old enough to drive a car. On Saturday mornings, Thomas walked with them across the north field. One morning, Noah asked, "Grandpa, is this your favorite place?" Thomas smiled. "No," the boy looked confused. "I thought you loved this field." "I do, but my favorite place is wherever the next generation is learning to care for it." Emily's partnership with the university continued to grow. What began as a simple soil study eventually became one of the region's most respected agricultural education programs. Every year, hundreds of students visited Carter farms. Future farmers, researchers, environmental scientists, agricultural entrepreneurs. Thomas never lectured. He simply walked with them. He would kneel down, scoop up a handful of earth, and ask the same question. "What do you see?" Some answered, "Soil." Others replied, "Nutrients, organic matter." "Healthy biology." Thomas would smile. "I see tomorrow." Those 3 words became famous among the students. Several graduates later admitted that they chose careers in sustainable agriculture because of a single visit to Carter Farms. One autumn afternoon, Thomas received a letter. This one wasn't from a developer. It was from the State Department of Agriculture. Carter Farms had been selected to receive the Legacy Stewardship Award, recognizing families who had protected productive farmland while promoting education, conservation, and community service across generations. At the ceremony, reporters once again asked the question Thomas had heard for years. "Mr. Carter, looking back, do you ever regret refusing $30 million? The audience became silent. Thomas smiled. Then he looked toward Daniel. Emily, Margaret, his grandchildren, and dozens of young farmers sitting in the audience. Finally, he answered, "If I had sold that field, I might have become a wealthy man. But I would have made my grandchildren poorer." The reporter frowned. "How?" Thomas smiled. "Because they would have inherited money instead of purpose." The room erupted in applause. A few years later, Thomas slowed down. Age had finally begun to win the race against time. He no longer drove the combine through long harvest days. Daniel had taken over most of the work, but every evening Thomas still made one final walk through the north field. One evening, Noah joined him. "Grandpa, do you think I'll farm this land someday?" Thomas looked across the golden corn glowing beneath the setting sun. "If you choose to, and if I don't," Thomas smiled, "then your responsibility is to make sure someone else loves it enough to care for it." Noah nodded thoughtfully. After a long silence, he asked one more question. "Were you ever tempted to sell again?" Thomas laughed softly. "No. Not because nobody asked, but because I finally learned something." "What?" Thomas stopped walking. He bent down, picked up one final handful of rich black soil, and placed it into Noah's hands. This is never just land. It's trust. Ladies and gentlemen, every story eventually reaches a verdict. Some are decided in courtrooms. Others are decided in quiet moments when nobody is watching. Thomas Carter never became the richest man in Willow Creek. He never appeared on the cover of business magazines. He never built shopping centers. He never owned luxury resorts. He never counted millions in a bank account. But he accomplished something far greater. He became a faithful steward. You see, there is a difference between ownership and stewardship. Ownership says, "This belongs to me." Stewardship says, "This has been entrusted to me." Ownership asks, "How much can I get?" Stewardship asks, "What can I leave behind?" Ownership measures success by accumulation. Stewardship measures success by preservation. And history has a remarkable way of remembering the people who protected something worth passing on. Perhaps you don't own farmland. Maybe you've never driven a tractor. Maybe you've never planted a single seed. But every one of us has a north field. For some, it's a family. For others, it's a business built from nothing. It might be your reputation, your faith, your values, your integrity, your community, or the next generation looking to you for guidance. One day, life will place a price on what matters most. It may not come as $30 million. It may come as an easy shortcut, a dishonest opportunity, a compromise that promises quick success, a decision that seems profitable today, but costly tomorrow. When that day comes, remember Thomas Carter. Remember Samuel Carter's letter. Remember the children who learned from healthy soil. Remember the neighbors who rebuilt together after the storm. And ask yourself one question. Will this decision make the next generation merely wealthier or truly richer? Because those are not always the same thing. Before I leave you today, let me share one last truth. The world will always tell you to chase more money, more possessions, more success. But the land has always whispered something different. Plant with patience, work with honesty. Protect what has been entrusted to you. Help your neighbors when the storm comes. And leave the field better than you found it. Because in the end, the greatest harvest is not the crop you gather. It is the legacy you leave behind. I'm Mr. Judge. Thank you for walking this field with me. Until next time, take care of the land. Take care of your word. And remember, every field has a story, and every harvest reveals the true measure of a person.